Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. We're going to get started here in about 30 seconds or so, allow people to filter in. So stand by just real quick. All right, we're going to go ahead and jump in. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody who is watching live, and those of you who are lucky enough to watch this recorded as well. This is going to be our webinar on cloud cost control, strategies for smarter spending. We are Netrix, and we'll go through a quick round of intros, but first of all, let's talk about a quick agenda for today. First, run through a round of introductions as to who I am and who Netrix is. Talk a little bit about why we're here, and then talk about some things that we can use to better cost optimize and better track costs in the cloud. Things like tagging and right sizing, and even things like application modernization. And then finally, we're going to close with a question and answer session and some contact info if you want to get a hold of us. So by way of introduction, my name is Tom Lilly. I'm a field CTO here for Cloud Solutions at Netrix Global. Yes, that is an old picture. I did used to have hair. But my goal here, or my job here at Netrix, is to essentially help clients develop cloud strategies and implement them. I've got over 15 years of cloud experience, including across the Azure Cloud, Microsoft 365, and hybrid cloud solutions. And I will be leading today's session on cloud cost management. So with that, we're going to go ahead and jump in. And I always like to start with what the problem is. I feel like most people here that are watching this have an idea of what the slides are going to be about, what this presentation is going to be about, but I always like to talk through it just to make sure we're on the same page. So when we're talking about costing in the cloud, the important thing to remember is that it's one of 5 pillars of what we call the well-architected framework, meaning it's essentially 20% of the important components of your cloud environment, and it does operate differently than you would on premises. For example, when you're buying your on-premises resources and components like your servers, your SAN, your switches, your routers, even cabling and things along those lines, those are capital expenditures. Generally speaking, you're going to be able to purchase them. You're going to be able to depreciate the assets. You can put them on a fixed schedule for replacement every 5 years or so. Those capital expenditures are easy to budget for and are, part of just the cost of doing business. As you move into the cloud, one of the main things that we start to look at are these operational expenditures. And it's not, I'm buying something up front. I can't depreciate assets. There's this timer that's just continuously running, or, this pay-as-you-go mentality is currently being utilized. And that's something to keep in mind, is that as you deploy resources in the cloud, by default, they are going to be pay-as-you-go. Every virtual machine or EC2 that you stand up, every gigabyte of data stored in in a storage account or in an S3 bucket is going to be billed based on what you utilize. And that there are some benefits to doing that, which we'll talk about later, but at the end of the day, that's not always the right way to go. That's not always what you want to do. The other good thing and potentially bad thing and as part of this conversation is that it's relatively easy to create things in the cloud. Being able to go into a portal and click, and now I've got all these resources at my fingertips. Or going into my infrastructure as code and just hitting, apply or deploy or something along those lines, it tends to be a lot easier to deploy that than, on premises, where maybe you have to go request new hardware and there's a procurement period, and then you have to reach out to your servers team to deploy the server and maybe your security team to approve it. In the cloud, if I don't have those controls in place, then I can actually deploy things very quickly, and it's not always going to be the best way to go. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but cloud costing is different from other platforms. When you're on premises, I don't know many organizations that are tracking their price per core or their price per gigabyte of RAM or their price per gigabyte of storage or things along those lines. Whereas in the cloud, all of those things matter. As you size your resources and as you utilize these resources, that becomes exceedingly important, is to understand how things are costed, whereas you may not be doing those on premises. The one upside to that I will say is that if you are looking to do some sort of showback or chargeback to your various departments, the cloud does actually make that a little bit easier, because now you do know what the cost of these 15 servers or these 14 Lambda functions, or this Elastic Beanstalk is actually costing you as an organization. And then finally, one of the main things that I hear a lot is, well, the cloud can be very expensive, and there are a lot of expensive resources out there. For example, there are several resources across both Azure and AWS that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars per month to run. And some organizations need them. Most of them probably don't. So how can we ensure that we're not deploying those resources inadvertently, and then you wake up and now you've got a surprise $100,000 bill that you have to justify to your CEO, CFO tomorrow morning? So hopefully some of those resonate with those of you on the call. And with that, we're going to go ahead and start talking about some of the things that we can do to actually make things a lot easier. And the first thing that we're going to talk about are what are called tags. So tags are one of the fundamental components of both Azure and AWS that, in my opinion, are vastly underrated by most organizations. And I guess we should start with, what is a tag? A tag is simply a key value pair that gets attached to a resource to give you additional information and context about that given resource or set of resources. In addition to this, you can also do tags with blank values. So for example, you can have automation that looks for a resource with a given tag key to say maybe it's development, or maybe it is shut down or something along those lines, where now you can have automation through functions or through Lambda that can actually go in and automatically shut down that resource, maybe size it down. Maybe it gets bucketed differently as you allocate those costs to somebody in the organization. The important thing to understand is that many, if not all, resources across these clouds support tags. So if you do have something deployed, there is a very good chance that it does support tags, and you can apply tags to them. And then those tags can then be viewed in the portal, or they can be surfaced through APIs. Here on the right side of this slide, we have a couple options. Here at the top is the Azure portal, where I've got my managed by and owner email tags available. At the bottom, I've got what can show up in the AWS portal with things like environment and cost center and owner. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about what these tags can do, some useful tags that we recommend to all of our clients, and then how to make your life easier when it comes to applying and reading these tags. So first of all, let's talk about some useful tags. So for anybody who has a landing zone in Azure or AWS, hopefully you've discussed a tagging strategy, which is these tags have to be applied. These tags should be applied. This is what we're going to do with them. These are the allowed values, things along those lines. We discuss that with all of our clients as we go into the well-architected framework and the overall governance and environmental controls in Azure as well. So when we talk about tags, usually we start with a basic set and then expand there based on what our clients need. So for example, for just general attribution, and this is, I've got a resource and I just want to know more about it. I want to know who owns it. I want to know the department that it belongs to. Maybe it doesn't have to be up 24/7 and I've got a startup on shutdown schedule. I want to know if it's production or non-production or UAT or staging or blue or green, whatever that is, and then finally, maybe even a project. This is for this is for this application. This is for this internally built app. This is for this COTS app that I'm leveraging. But generally having these attributions on your resources make it a lot easier to figure out who's paying for what and who should be paying for what if they're not today. And even if you're not going to do any sort of chargeback or showback, this does allow you to make intelligent decisions as you go to deploy and even destroy some resources. Maybe you have somebody unexpectedly leave the organization, and now you want to look at all of the cloud resources that were under their name. Maybe your IT department is going through a budgeting cycle and they want to see what their current cloud spends are. Maybe you want to see what the cost of your prod versus non-prod environments are, and maybe make some adjustments to non-production to overall reduce those costs. All of those things become very important as we get into that attribution side of things. And that's where these tags really come in handy. Having a department tag of IT or having a project tag of Active Directory or whatever it is will help you make those informed and conscious decisions about your cloud costing environment. On the cost specific side, we do also recommend various tags. So number one, cost center. If you as an organization do have established cost centers, why not add them to a resource? It makes it very easy to do that attribution and becomes very important once again as you go and try to surface those costs and make them known to the rest of the organization. We're going to talk about budgets here in a little bit, but if you don't want to leverage some of the built-in budgeting capabilities, having a budget tag is also important. Maybe you have some automation that's built off of that reads it and then gives you some notifications. Maybe the budget automatically increases based on the usage of other tools like InfraCost, like we'll talk about here. Cost allocation itself is also very important. This can be either a single cost allocation or a multi-cost allocation. What I mean by that is, if I have one specific solution, let's say I'm running a security solution on a set of EC2 or virtual machines, those are pretty easily attributable back to my security team. They are the ones who requested this tool. They're the ones that are going to have to pay for this tool. However, if I have a shared resource, maybe like a firewall or a reverse proxy or something along those lines that's accepting and utilizing and distributing traffic from multiple services, maybe I want to spread that cost across multiple different teams. Maybe I want to be able to allocate by percentage that cost to those different teams as well. And that's where having this cost allocation tag is a really great way for you to automatically or semi-automatically divvy up those costs between those teams. And then finally, one that I think is very underrated as well is expiration date. If you're running a proof of concept or proof of technology, or maybe a non-production or lower environment, it's important if you want to expire those resources to have that expiration date on there, because now you can run that automation and actually say, okay, well, this expires in 3 days. Do you need to extend it? Or, hey, this is past expiry. You should be deleting this because you said it was only going to be good for 3 months and we're going into month 4. So as you're going into applying these key value pairs to your resources, as mentioned earlier, these are a lot of tags that we recommend to our clients. And we recommend you at least use this as a starting point if you don't have one already. And then once again, make it your own for your organization. Now, requiring and enforcing these tags is a lot of work. I'm not here to say that it's very easy, but there are ways that we highly recommend you utilize to make it easier on everybody. Number one is enforcing it at the deployment time. So using tools like Azure Policy and AWS Config, we can actually enforce that if a resource doesn't have a specific set of tags, that's actually marked as non-compliant. And now it shows up in a dashboard. Now it shows up through APIs. Now it's discoverable that, hey, somebody didn't put the proper tag on these resources, and I can go after them with pitchforks and torches and make sure that people are tagging things appropriately. In addition, we do highly recommend the usage of infrastructure as code solutions, whether you're cloud agnostic like Terraform or Tofu, or whether you are within a specific cloud like ARM templates and Bicep or CloudFormation templates. All of these services, all of these infrastructure as code solutions can automatically apply tags on deployment. And once again, you can either prompt for them as a parameter, or you can automatically apply those tags based on other deployment parameters as well. So we can actually automate, or once again, semi-automate the application of these tags to any resource that gets deployed. So highly recommend that if you're not looking at infrastructure as code, that you at least give it an evaluation. It also gives you some other really good capabilities like integration with third-party tools, as well as approval gates that maybe you don't get out of the portals, or just general API calls or through PowerShell or Python. But we do highly, highly recommend at least evaluating it. And then the last piece isn't really even a technology, it's a process thing. I can't tell you how many organizations I walk into that don't have their SOPs for cloud actually documented and published anywhere. So people are trying to deploy something, they don't know that these tags are required, or maybe they can only deploy into these regions. Maybe they can only deploy these resource types. Those kind of things aren't documented anywhere. So as you're going through and building out that landing zone, as you're building out that sort of, walled off area in your cloud, document those SOPs, put them somewhere that everybody who needs them can get access to them. I think documentation of environments and resources is vastly underrated. So I definitely want to call this one out because it's something that a lot of my clients are not doing, and they're expecting that, hey, my cloud team is small. There's no need to document because, Jim Bob over here knows how the cloud works. Well, now that team expands from 1 to 3 people, or maybe Jim Bob retires and you have to bring in somebody else. And without any documentation, it's kind of the wild, wild west. So highly recommend documenting things like tagging requirements as you build out your cloud environment and embark on your cloud journey. So with that, we do also want to talk about things like right sizing and adjusting the size of your resources to make sure that you're leveraging the cloud as appropriate. So if you're on premises, it tends to be relatively easy to over provision resources that underpin your servers and services. I can't see everybody who's watching this right now, but virtually raise your hand if you've ever heard any of these excuses that, hey, I know the code doesn't really work that well, but if we just throw a few more CPU cores or a few more gig of RAM at it, we should be fine. Or the way we're doing our batch processing, we can't really change that up. So can I just get an extra 100 gigabytes of storage, so I can better use that for swap space, or better use that for processing? Or hey, you know what? I know this application doesn't run that great, but I think it's a storage issue. So just move it to our all flash array. Move it to NVMe. Just move it around and let's go ahead and figure out. We're not going to worry about it. We're just going to let it do its thing. Or my favorite, and this isn't to say anything bad about anyone here who works on the networking team, but it's the network. It's our network is slow, or we've got too much latency, or things like that. These excuses we hear a lot of on premises because it's very easy to just throw more resources at it. Maybe I just need to add another port to my port channel. Maybe I just need to move my disks to my all flash array. Maybe I just do need to add a few more cores or a few more gig of RAM. For on premises, we're not actually figuring out what that's going to cost me as an organization. And what that leads to is just a ballooning of not just the underlying infrastructure, but the individual services as well. And then the thing to keep in mind is that now if I've got a resource or I've got a server on premises that I move into the cloud, it's very easy to say, okay, well, this has 32 cores and 128 gig of RAM on premises. I'm just going to move it up into the cloud as an EC2 with 32 and 128 because I know that works, and I just don't want to have to worry about resizing it and right sizing it or things like that. The other thing to keep in mind is that depending on how new your hardware is on-prem, or what kind of hardware you're running on premises, that moving those services up as is into the cloud can actually exacerbate performance issues. If you're running on a different processor architecture, you're running, switch from Intel to AMD, for example, that can drastically reduce, or in some cases even increase performance as you move your servers from your on-premises infrastructure into a cloud infrastructure. So all of these things are things that we need to talk about and evaluate from what we're running on premises to how we actually move it into the cloud. But the one thing I do want to impress in this section is that it is imperative that you get it right in the cloud, because as you scale resources up, generally speaking, your costs are going to scale relatively linearly. If I double the size of my EC2 instance, I'm essentially going to double my costs. And the thing to keep in mind is that as you increase those costs, as you get more performance, that cost is going to increase. There are various ways to fix that, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. But keep in mind that now I can, if I'm on premises and I say, well, this actually needs only 4 cores, but we're going to give it 8, or maybe it only needs 16 gig of RAM, but we're going to give it 32. There is a linear operational expenditure every single time you increase those costs. So it's important that you want to get those sized appropriately. Now, the good thing, and sometimes bad thing, is that sizing those resources and deployments is usually just a click of a button. I go into the portal, or I go into my infrastructure as code, or I go into my API calls, and I say, well, I actually want to size this up. Maybe I want to size this down. Maybe I want to drastically increase this because I'm concerned about cloud performance. It's relatively easy to do. Now, the downside of that is it's relatively easy to do. So if you do have somebody who's a little click happy, or somebody who doesn't understand the linearity of costs in the cloud, that maybe they just go in there and keep bumping up the size by a handful of cores, or maybe they just keep adding a handful more storage, not realizing the long-term ramifications of allocating that and the cost therein. So because of that, we do highly recommend right sizing upon any sort of migration effort. If you're coming from on-premises into a cloud platform, there are several tools, which we'll talk about, that you can leverage to right size your workloads. And that can either be, sizing them up or sizing them down, which we'll talk about here in just a second as well. But being able to size them appropriately from a storage, from a compute, from a memory perspective, from a bandwidth perspective, all of these things become exceedingly important. But it's also important to understand that you don't want to lose sight of this. While we do highly recommend right sizing on migration, and you should be doing that, it doesn't mean you can just forget about it afterwards. So go ahead and start resizing those resources afterwards. Put something in your calendar that every 3 months you want to take a look at some of the tooling to ensure that you are running optimally. Make sure that as you are approving new workloads in the cloud, they are being sized appropriately and they're being appropriately justified. These are all important things to keep in mind as we talk about right sizing. The other thing to keep in mind is that as we get into reservations, which we'll talk about here in just a minute, we want to make sure things are sized appropriately before you purchase reservations, because there are some potential ramifications if you don't do so. Maybe you have to return reservations or exchange them or things along those lines. And then one thing that I do absolutely want to call out is that we're talking about right sizing, and generally when I'm talking to clients, they see right sizing as I need to reduce the size of things to be the bare minimum. I need to be able to have a minimum standard of service or a minimum standard of performance and nothing more than that. The important thing to understand is that that isn't just scaling resources down. That can also include scaling resources up. Because as we start talking about cost efficiency and cloud costing, if you can justify the increase in costs, that maybe if I increase the cost by one tier and therefore double it, for example, maybe this batch job now runs 4 times more efficiently than it did before. Or maybe I can close my books for the month, 4 hours earlier. There are certain benefits to being able to size these workloads up and not just talk about sizing them down. So I do want to talk about how that is exceedingly important as you're going into the cloud, is evaluating going both directions. So when you're undergoing a migration, we highly recommend the usage of some of the built-in tools to get this sizing properly, as I mentioned before, either the AWS Application Discovery Service or Azure Migrate. So using these to assess the environment and get information on what the right size and what the right SKU for these virtual machines and EC2 instances is going to be. But at the same time, it also gives you an idea of what your cloud costs are projected to be. Now you can go to your CFO, you can go to your board, you can go to your director, whoever it is, and make that justification to say, well, our projection right now is that moving into the cloud is going to cost us X amount per month. And if we take a look at our hardware refresh, it's going to cost Y. Therefore, we think it makes sense to do this or move some workloads up. We do also recommend that if you're running any COTS apps, so any off-the-shelf applications, you do follow the recommended specifications. A lot of organizations, as they develop these applications, are going to test them rigorously in various environments and come up with the recommendations for their service sizing. So make sure that as you're leveraging these COTS apps, as you're deploying them into your cloud provider of choice, that you are following their recommended specifications. Maybe you do get a chance to deploy it and maybe it is over or under performance. At that point, you can right size, but at least from the outset, from at least the beginning, we do highly recommend leveraging the recommendations that your vendors are providing. For those of you who are leveraging your own application catalog, or maybe you have lower environments of off-the-shelf applications, it is important to track your utilization in lower environments. Now, the one thing to keep in mind is that lower environments do generally have less traffic and less burden. So it is important to extrapolate those But essentially tracking your utilization in those lower environments does allow you to make better informed decisions of what your staging and production environments are going to look like. So definitely making sure you track that, especially for homegrown applications, to check each tier is also very important to do throughout your environment. Now, I mentioned earlier a little bit about reservations. So as discussed, costing in the cloud by default, for the most part, is going to be pay as you go. Pay as you go means that for every gigabyte of data stored, for every second or minute or hour that my server is turned on, for every gigabyte of data transferred, for every AI query that is submitted to the service, that the meter is going to be running based on what you use. It's not going to be, just one flat fee for the most part. It's going to be really, truly pay as you go. That if I have 10% more storage used next month, then I'm going to pay 10% more in storage, because that's just the way that it works. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. There are a lot of workloads that actually make a lot of sense to be billed pay as you go. If you regularly shut down some resources because you are scaling in your edge servers, or maybe your non-production environments don't need to be turned on because your developers only work, regular shifts. If you are regularly shutting something down, even if it's just over the weekend, generally speaking, pay as you go can actually make a lot of sense, rather than going through and purchasing reservations and making that longer term commitment. Number two, just to harken back to what we were just talking about, before you right size resources, it is important, or it's recommended, that you run them as pay as you go, because maybe you want to change sizes. You want to see if bringing it down is going to have a drastic effect, or maybe you want to see if sizing it up is going to have a drastic effect. So ensuring that those resources get right sized first is also important. And then finally, any resources that don't have a guaranteed future. Maybe you're doing a proof of concept or a proof of technology. Maybe you have a sandbox environment where your developers are kicking the tires on web apps or Beanstalk or RDS or something along those lines, and you're not sure if you're going to keep it around because you're not quite sure how it's going to work for you long term. If there is no guaranteed future for these resources, a lot of times pay as you go is the right way to go. However, for full-time, 24/7, long-term resources, pay as you go is going to be the most expensive option. And I'm sure cloud providers would love to take more of your money, but we here at this webinar are talking about how we don't have to do that. So the two main ways that we talk about doing this are either through reservations or savings plans. So reservations are going to be very specific allocations of resources for either 1 or 3 year, or in some cases 5-year terms, where I can say, I want to prepay for this tier of virtual machine in this resource. I want to prepay for this many gigabytes of storage in this S3 bucket. All of these things, and there are a lot of resources in all clouds that can be reserved, where a lot of my clients really look at their compute. But the important thing to keep in mind is that there are other instances where you can also get reservations for other resource types. So highly recommend you take a look at what's available and see what reservations can be applied to your environment. And when we're talking about applying reservations, there are some potentially significant savings available. For example, if you go up to a 3-year reservation for some resources, you can save up to 75% on the cost of some of your services. And this obviously adds up across the fleet of your entire cloud architecture and your cloud infrastructure. So, looking at some of these resources, we do recommend where possible to go with 3-year reservations. If you're really just dipping your toe in the cloud and you're not sure if you're going to keep it, or maybe you're trying to figure out if you're going to change things around, maybe a 1-year reservation does make sense if you do have some of those commitment issues. But at the end of the day, your maximized savings are really going to be provided if you do that 3-year reservation. Once again, providing savings of up to that 75%, which, as you can imagine, is pretty significant. Some other things to keep in mind is that some reservations can also be transferred between resources. So in Azure, for example, if I have a specific series of virtual machine in a region, that if I delete that virtual machine, but I create another one of the exact same size, that reservation is going to transfer over. So there are a lot of these situations where reservations aren't going to be tied to an individual resource. They're actually going to float around and apply to any applicable resource that matches the terms of that reservation. Now, a lot of times that also determines on how you purchase that reservation, but keep in mind that you do have some of those capabilities. Now, as I mentioned before, reservations are very specific. They're meant to work on a specific SKU of EC2 or a specific tier of virtual machine or specific type of storage. So if you do have concerns about the flexibility and the elasticity of your environment, you have the other option of what are called savings plans in both AWS and Microsoft Azure. So these savings plans essentially allow you to commit to a certain amount of resource utilization across your entire estate of virtual machines and your entire estate of EC2 instances. And what this does is this allows you to prepay for compute up to a certain threshold. And then what's going to happen then is that any compute that is above that threshold is then going to be billed at pay-as-you-go rates. Now, these savings plans are going to offer a lower discount. You're not going to get that 75% discount as part of your savings plan, but it does still give you that middle ground between a reservation and pay-as-you-go rates. So what I have a lot of my clients doing, and what I recommend for a lot of you that are watching and listening to this webinar, is that anything that you know is going to be around long-term, once again, your firewalls, things like Active Directory domain controllers, your core tier 0 business applications, et cetera, those should be reserved. Once again, 3 years if you can do it. Buy reservations for those resources. And then for the rest of your infrastructure that isn't covered by reservations, take a look and see what savings plans can do for you. Because the thing to keep in mind is that these are not mutually exclusive. You can have reservations apply to some of your compute or some of your storage, and then have savings plans apply to the rest of your compute infrastructure. So you can actually leverage both to maximize your savings and still maintain the flexibility that you need within your environment. Now, if you don't know where to start, which is where a lot of my clients come to us, there are tools that are built into these clouds to help you make those decisions. In Azure, we have Azure Advisor, and then in AWS, we have AWS Cost Explorer that can provide recommendations on purchasing these reservations and savings plans. And these will actually tell you like, hey, you should purchase X number of these reservations, or this should be, the level that you purchase for your savings plans. Now, we do highly recommend you evaluate these recommendations against your environment, against what you know, before you decide to just move forward and blanket purchase these items. But the Advisor and Cost Explorer capabilities at least get you started, get you an idea of what you can do and where you should be as you move forward with your reservation and savings plan journey. Now, we talked about some tooling about real-time analysis. So let's talk about a little bit more. And this is exceedingly important because, as you're deploying in the cloud, you can do everything right. You can deploy a policy or a config. You can put the right roles in place or do, attribute-based access control or ABAC. At the end of the day, you want to know what's going on in your environment. Maybe you have some AWS accounts that some people have spun up that you've lost track of, or the same thing with Azure subscriptions. Maybe somebody accidentally misclicked something in the portal and you don't have the right auditing or denials in place to keep that from happening. Maybe you have somebody who left the organization, as I mentioned before, that didn't do proper knowledge transfer. You don't quite know what's out there. You don't have a good feel for, what's in the environment and how it's being used and things like that. It is exceedingly important to deploy these guardrails in the environment and monitor those guardrails and ensure that you as an organization, or at least the right people in the organization, are getting these alerts. And that's where having that monitoring and operations are even more important than those guardrails, because maybe you do have a situation that isn't covered by your policy or by your config to block and audit. Maybe you have a new situation because a new service or a new resource type was just released in the cloud, and you don't have anything in place and people are going and just deploying it, and now it's costing a lot. So having this monitoring in place, having an operationalized procedure in place is also important. this gets back to documentation, as we were talking about before, that once again, I feel like nobody likes doing documentation, but it is a necessary evil for a lot of organizations. But making sure that you're at least taking a look and seeing what's happening in the environment is going to be very important. And where I usually start is budgets. So in both AWS and Azure, we have what are called budgets. And for any of you who have run these for your home, you probably know what I'm talking about, but let's just talk about what this looks like in the cloud. So budgets are used to monitor and forecast costs at a given scope. So what you can do is you can essentially say, this set of resources, my budget for it is $500 a month, just to make the numbers relatively easy. So now I can actually set alerts that say, okay, my actual just hit 50%, I'm at $250. Okay, my actuals just hit 100%, I'm at $500. Hey, my actuals hit 125%, something really wrong is going on here. Maybe whoever submitted the budget didn't do so accurately. Maybe somebody sized up a resource and I didn't know about it. Maybe there's a much higher usage on it this month than there was last month. At the end of the day, the goal is to understand what is going on and track how your resource costs are affecting you as an organization. Now, the nice thing about this is that these budgets can work on both actuals and forecasts, and once again, are not mutually exclusive. So for example, I can get alerts when my actuals hit 50% and 100% and 125%, but maybe I want to get an alert if my forecast is projected to reach 110%. So now I know halfway through the month or even a quarter of the way through the month that, hey, you're forecasting a lot higher than expected. You should take a look at this before you have an unexpected bill. Or maybe you can go to the application owner, because you know who it is based on tags, to be able to go and justify that additional cost. So those are going to be exceedingly important as we talk about actually monitoring what's going on, and not only looking at, in the past, what's happened previously, getting the alerts on your actuals, but moving forward, what is this going to look like in this month? How do I get ahead of this and maybe size this resource back down, or maybe even shut it down altogether if I see that it's not being in use? So make sure you're setting those thresholds, and make sure that you're setting those alert emails or your push notifications to make sure that you know what's happening and when. And just like tags, we highly recommend integrating these budgets with your infrastructure as code solution. Whenever you're deploying the appropriate resource types, go ahead and attach a budget to it. Make sure you know who gets those emails. These become very important, and they become a no-brainer as you work through your infrastructure as code solution to make sure that it's done for you automatically. The other thing to keep in mind with infrastructure as code is that a lot of times I'm talking to my clients and they say, well, we want to estimate what this is going to cost to run in the cloud. And I'll come back and get a server output, or maybe look at Azure Migrate or Cost Explorer or ADS and come back and say, okay, well, the projected cost is here. And that's great if I have existing infrastructure that I can actually analyze. But for anything that new, I have to go into the appropriate calculator. I have to find the right resource types. I have to find the right sizes. I have to do the aggregation and summation and return that back to the team. There are third-party tools like InfraCost that can integrate with infrastructure as code solutions that, for example, when I run a Terraform or Tofu plan, that it actually analyzes that and gives me the projected cost for those resources. So now I can build that into my deployment pipeline to say, okay, well, somebody has submitted a request to deploy these 5 EC2 instances. These 5 EC2 instances are going to cost us $250 a month. And before somebody clicks the approve button, they have to review that budget. They have to review that output and make sure that is within budget of an organization, and also even make sure that a budget is applied and analyzing those specific resources. So by leveraging infrastructure as code and automation where possible, and these third-party tools like InfraCost, I can better get an idea of what these new deployments and new services are going to be costing me. So highly recommend at least evaluating infrastructure as code if you haven't before, and this is just one other reason why. Now, we talked a little bit about advisors before. These are going to be very important because they're going to give you information on what can be right-sized and what can be modernized within your environment. There are 2 major advisor platforms that we do recommend. Number one is AWS Trusted Advisor, and the other one is going to be called Azure Advisor. The nice thing is if you work in both clouds, they have very similar names, so hopefully very easy to remember. As you can see here across both of these screenshots, that we're getting projections for monthly cost savings or annual cost savings in the case for the Azure portal. So I can actually come in here and say, okay, these are the recommendations. These are the reservations that I should purchase. This is the amount of savings plan that I should be purchasing. Once again, these tools will make those recommendations on purchasing those longer term commitments. The other thing to keep in mind is that these tools will also give you recommendations on right sizing. So if you do have a resource that is running at 110%, or maybe it's only running at 5% utilization, then you can actually get those recommendations and get that high level review in these advisor platforms. So once again, as we're talking about like operationalizing, just operationalization in general of your cloud environment, reviewing these advisors on a regular basis is exceedingly important. I know I've said that a lot, but I'm trying to reiterate the things that I see a lot of my clients not necessarily do right that could, easily reduce their cloud costs by 20, 30, or even up to 50%. And these advisor portals and the regular review of them are certainly fall within that category. The other thing, and I know we're not really talking about that as part of this webinar, but I do want to call it out, is these advisor portals also cover the other 4 pillars of the well-architected framework. So if you're wondering if your DR is set up properly, or if you have the right performance going on in your environment, or even the security posture of your environment, all of those things can also be included in these advisor portals. And then once again, become that one-stop shop to ensure that the overall health of your environment and how it applies and works against the well-architected framework. It's not just for costing, although costing is a major component that we always do like to talk about. And then the other thing that I certainly want to talk about here as well is FinOps. I get a lot of questions from my clients about, well, how do I shift some of these things left? How do I operationalize, some of these tools and some of these insights and things like that? Well, FinOps, a very creative name for financial operations, is available, and it's a framework and a set of tools that you can use to manage and operationalize your cloud environments. FinOps, if you haven't heard of it before, is really focused on data-driven decisions around cost optimization. So these will actually look at things like your actual rate cards in the cloud, as well as your historical monthly costs, or even your projected future costs, depending on how you have it set up, and help you make decisions on what should be done and what can be done, and how you should optimize your environment. This leverages APIs to extract and parse data, to essentially pull it into a cost management tool, which we'll talk about here on this a little bit later in the slide. But the important thing is to have that tool and pull that data in, even if it's an Excel spreadsheet that's working off of like a SQL database, for example. Having something available is very important. But the other thing to keep in mind is that FinOps isn't just technology. It's not just pulling this data, and it's not just visualizing it through a dashboard. It's also business process. It's what do I have to do as an owner to get something new approved? It's what are my weekly, monthly, and quarterly tasks to make sure that my cloud environment is optimized from a cost perspective. There is that business process side of things that is also very, very important. And then the one thing I do also want to keep in mind is that there are actually some really good built-in tools and dashboards that you can leverage for those of you who are on M365 solutions in Power BI. So Microsoft actually publishes a FinOps toolkit. These are some example screenshots of that toolkit that can give you that information. And then once again, leveraging your existing investments in Power BI, you can now visualize this data and your Fabric and OneLake and some of the other capabilities there. Now, the other thing to keep in mind here is that as we're talking about pulling data from APIs and data standardization is what we call focus. The FinOps Open Cost and Usage Specification is a standardized data structure for your cloud platforms that is agnostic across most clouds. We're talking about AWS, talking about Azure, even GCP, OCI, and I believe even Alibaba leverage Focus for some of their cost management exports. I say some of because they do have specific APIs they do recommend for exporting data that's going to be used for FinOps. And then they have other, built-in cost management capabilities that maybe aren't based on Focus. For our purposes and for this slide, we're just going to talk about Focus in general. And the important thing to keep in mind is because that data structure, that data schema is standardized, that now multi-cloud customers, you can actually centralize across all environments. Or maybe if you do move from one cloud to the other, you can still take your dashboards and they're going to be leverageable across any cloud that you do decide to deploy into. That also means that you can have your data pipelines or have your ETL processes or have your data ingestion capabilities go into your favorite platform and then create unified dashboards, create unified alerts across multiple clouds. Publish them out, leverage other open source, dashboards and reports and things like that other people have published. And because this data is all standardized, you can easily leverage it across all of your environments in multiple different ways. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that Focus is going to be applied to anything in the environment that generates a cost. So it's not just going to be for the big ticket items like virtual machines and your storage. It's going to be everything in that environment that you have to pay for is going to be covered under Focus, and then therefore can be brought under that umbrella of FinOps. So very important that we talk about this and the standardization. And this is sort of the way that I recommend my clients move forward as they start to talk about data visualization and things like that. And then finally, let's go ahead and talk about one of my favorite topics, which is modernization. So when we talk about migration, we usually talk about the Gartner 6 R's of cloud migration, of which a lot of times our clients start with what's called a rehost migration. You may have heard this as a forklift migration or a lift and shift migration. But at the end of the day, a rehost migration is pretty straightforward. I've got a physical server or a VM on premises, and now it's a virtual machine or an EC2 instance in the cloud. It's very simple to do. If you need to exit a data center, if you have contracts that are expiring, if you're concerned about certain acquisitions increasing the cost of your hypervisor, and you want to get out of your data center very quickly, then rehost migrations are a great option for you. They can be done relatively quickly. They require very minimal changes to your application stack because they're still running on virtualized infrastructure in the cloud. But at the end of the day, they're not always the best way to go. Rehost migrations tend to be very inefficient, and not just in hard costs, but also soft costs, because now I'm running a virtual machine that, if it's Windows, I have to pay for the operating system potentially. But now I still have to patch that machine. I still need to maintain a staff and have that staff allocate time to patching and securing and doing all these things that, maybe they could be doing better things at the end of the day. Virtual machines just in general are inefficient, and there's no real way to get around that until we start talking about modernization. The other thing to keep in mind is that most servers lend themselves toward hosting monolithic apps. Is that great? Now I've got one application server in my middle tier that's handling everything. And maybe there's one component of that application that needs more resources than the others. Well, too bad. I've got to scale up that entire virtual machine or entire EC2 instance, and now I have to pay that linear cost because of one component of my application. And that's one of those things to keep in mind is that if you do have these monolithic apps that, you're kind of having the tail wag the dog sometimes, is that you do have, these potential times where you do need to make those updates for solely one component. So that's why we recommend at some point refactoring your applications, whether you do it as part of your migration into the cloud or whether you do it as a post hoc task. We do definitely recommend you do it. And by refactoring, I really just mean modernization. I mean, taking these monolithic applications and breaking them up into microservices. Maybe I can break out my authentication authorization service. Maybe I can break out my dashboard presentation service. Maybe I can break out data ingestion, and all these things can be adjusted individually and be deployed as these microservices that, once again, scale based on need. Maybe I have a huge influx in my application at the beginning of the month because of offers that I am putting out. Now I can scale out my authentication authorization service without having to, necessarily scale out my data ingestion that's pulling from third-party programs. And a lot of that is built into what we call platform services. So these are your RDS or relational database service. These are your S3 buckets. These are your SQL platform as a service. These are functions or Lambda, things along those lines. Those platform services can scale up to match the need of your environment. And the other way, a lot of these services can also scale down to zero. And now you don't have to pay for them at all until they need to be used. And a lot of them also offer very quick startup times that if they do scale to zero, nobody even knows about it. We do also highly recommend leveraging SaaS services where possible. So this is like your Microsoft 365s, Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, et cetera, that if you don't need to leverage S3 or a storage account for data storage, why not take a look at putting that in SharePoint or OneDrive? If you're leveraging an Exchange server or an SMTP server out of your cloud environment, why not take a look at relaying off of Google or Exchange Online? So even expanding beyond the traditional cloud provider into other SaaS platforms can also be very helpful. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that not all apps can be modernized. Mostly, from what I've seen, a lot of off-the-shelf apps do not support platform services, but it's worth evaluating. Talk to your vendors, see if it's supported. I have anecdotal experience where we actually reached out to a vendor as I had a client who wanted to modernize a COTS app. And we asked the vendor, we're like, hey, is it possible that we can run this on SQL platform as a service in Azure? And the vendor came back and said, well, let me talk to our engineering team. And 2 weeks later, we got an official support statement for it, and we deployed that backend on SQL PaaS. So those are exceedingly important, once again, not to keep using the phrase, to evaluate even your COTS apps to see if they can be modernized. We also recommend performing that 6R assessment. Look at your application portfolio. And I'm looking at all applications, even tier 0 applications like Active Directory. Can these be modernized? Can I switch to something like Entra? Is this a good factor? Is this a good candidate for retiring even or replacing with a SaaS solution? Where we generally like to see our clients start, or where we generally recommend our clients start as part of the 6R assessment is even internal applications, public-facing applications, ones that can scale. Generally speaking, homegrown ones are the easiest way to start. But the other one that we also like to talk about is data estate. Leveraging a large SQL server for your data warehouse doesn't make a lot of sense when you can do the same thing on cloud native solutions. So all of these can become potential candidates for modernization, and we do recommend that our clients start there. So with that, what can you do? What are your next steps? What as an organization can you undertake to rein in your costs in the cloud? Number one, assess your environment, assess your on-premises, assess your cloud, and see what you're doing that could be modernized. Just kind of pulling through that last slide, make sure you know what's out there and how it's being used, and to see if there's a way to make it a little bit more modern, make it a little bit more efficient. Tag your resources, develop a tagging strategy, publish your tagging strategy, implement the tagging strategy. Very important that you do all of those things so you know where your costs are going. And then you can, once again, go after people or departments or leads or whatever it is to make sure that they are paying for what they're leveraging. That ties into FinOps. Evaluate FinOps. There's a lot of great documentation out there on the internet. So take a look at developing and implementing that FinOps strategy and centralizing your costing data into a visualization platform like Power BI. That's going to be very important as you start to more regularly evaluate your financial options. And at the same time, deploy FinOps dashboards, deploy cloud dashboards, deploy reports that are going to allow you to more easily track that data. And at the same time, pull in the budget information, implement those budgets, get these proactive notifications. Don't get surprised by these bills at the end of the month because somebody sized up a resource and nobody knew about it. So make sure you're implementing those budgets. Make sure you're implementing those appropriate tools to get these notifications. And then finally, purchase your reservations, get your savings plans, leverage trusted advisor or advisor to determine what should happen. making sure you're buying long term is going to be better for you as an organization for, once again, those resources that make sense. So hopefully these 6 ideas and this presentation in general have given you an idea of some of the things that you can do to better optimize your costs in the cloud. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and take a look at our question panel and see if there's anything waiting for us. And that is going to be our last item of the day. And I don't see any questions. So with that, I'm going to move on to our contact slide. Hopefully that you have found this enlightening, or at least learned a little bit of something from this webinar. If you're interested in talking about cloud cost optimization and you're a current customer, please reach out to your account executive and let's schedule a discussion to talk about cloud costing. Once again, it's very important for any of my clients that are going to the cloud. If you're not currently a customer, but you'd still like to talk about cloud costing, please reach out to me. My email is here on this slide, tlilly@netrixllc.com. You can always reach out, and I'm always happy to talk about this topic if you haven't figured that out from this webinar. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and close it down and say thank you for those of you who are with us live, and thank you for those of you who are watching the recording. Good luck with your cost management, and see you soon. Thanks.